Well, thank you, Mark. Hope everybody can hear me. As Mark said, my name is Joe Sauer from Sentient Decision Science, and I have a confession to make today. I'm hoping that this is the crowd to whom that confession can most easily be made. I was a geek growing up. I wasn't one of the cool kids, and suffered many afflictions because of that. My colleagues who are sitting in the front row will probably heckle me. Would claim that's less of a confession and more of a grudging acceptance of reality for someone who ended up in decision sciences. But I was desperate when I was a teenager, as most teenagers are, to be one of the cool kids, or at least to get access to the cool kids. And as many teenagers do when their parents go away, I decided I was going to throw a party. And I was going to invite all the cool kids over to the house, and they could use my house, my parents' house, as a place to have a party, and that way I would get to be able to rub elbows with the cool kids, and something would wear off, and I would be a cool kid. I'd be admitted to the privileged circle. And you probably know where I'm going with this. Told everybody there was going to be a party, and nobody showed up. What I realized, looking back on that, is that I had fallen prey, if you take a behavioral sciences approach to that, I'd fallen prey to the familiarity bias, or the familiarity or heuristic. I had offered, in technology terms, I had offered a platform for people to have a party, but I hadn't offered a compelling reason to use that platform over the platforms that they had already used and were familiar with. So I tell you that story to tell you this one. We heard from Merrill this morning about how some of his frustrations, that 2005 was the year of mobile, and then 2006 was the year of mobile, 2007 was the year of mobile. Mobile has become the shiny new toy in the research industry. And what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking to you about what we need to do responsibly as researchers to enhance, accommodate, embrace, accelerate the adoption of mobile as a data collection technique. And the cautionary note that I'll throw out there is we need to be very careful as a research community to not take one step forward. We have this wonderful new technology that allows us to capture respondent data in the moment. It allows us to append a whole lot of data to that respondent record that laptops and desktops haven't allowed us to do, whether it's geotagging, video, all sorts of other in-the-moment types of techniques. But as we embrace this new data collection platform, the house that I was offering, we need to have compelling reasons for the cool kids to use it. And the cool kids are client-side researchers. We need the cool kids to come to the party. And that's really one of the struggles that mobile has had since 2005, is most innovation in mobile data collection or mobile research has focused on the platform, not so much on the methodologies that we're using. And now, for the last 2, 3, 4 years, there's been a concerted effort, as these platforms have matured and stabilized, been a concerted effort to think more about the methodologies that we employ on these mobile devices. It's no longer acceptable to simply use a semantic anchored Likert scale or some sort of stated preference or stated intention scale. We need to start embracing and pushing into the mainstream research techniques, particularly over mobile devices, that are able to capture and quantify the non-conscious pieces of decision making. Otherwise, we're at risk of using a wonderfully rich new data collection vehicle to take 2 steps back and use retrograde methods. And we can't afford to have that happen if we want to continue to see this platform grow and really be maximized in terms of its benefit to us as researchers. And so for the last 10 or 11 years, Sentient has been in the business of doing exactly that, trying to develop tools and methods that quantify emotion. And I don't put this up in any hope that you can read it, but only really to draw your attention to the fact that we've known intuitively for some time, we each know without being researchers, we know that consumers do not behave rationally 100% of the time, nor do they behave 100% rationally any of the time. There's an entire industry that's been built up around CPG merchandising that's built around these whole ideas that the consumer does not behave rationally. Part of their decision making is influenced by rational thoughts, rational considerations, reflections, but equally, and sometimes even more so, those decisions are influenced by non-conscious stimulus, non-conscious reactions, non-conscious considerations. And we need to develop decision-making models, predictive models, that incorporate both those explicit considerations, what Daniel Kahneman in his now famous book from 2011 called Thinking Fast and Slow, what we would call System 2 considerations, rational, deliberative, reflective. But we also need to incorporate non-conscious measures into those decision models to capture the element of decision-making that's actually not occurring on a reflective, rational basis, what we call an explicit basis. What Kahneman would call what Kahneman calls System 1 thinking, if you will. And so we've been doing this, as I said, for about 11 years, but we certainly weren't first to the market. When you actually go back in the literature, I mentioned Kahneman before. Kahneman's book was published in 2011, but he actually published a paper in 1972 that essentially debunked the idea of the rational consumer. And that was 40 years ago. So as frustrated as Merrill has been with the slow pace of adoption since 2005 of research or of mobile research technology, neuroscientists, neuropsychologists in the field of research have been even slower to adopt some of these behavioral sciences principles. Kahneman's paper in 72 is actually preceded in the 50s by Herbert Simon, who wrote about the satisficing theory and this idea that we make suboptimal decisions because good enough is good enough, and we don't always make rational, value-maximizing decisions. What in research, in say conjoint research, is the baseline of everything we do: linear, accretive, or additive utility measures of decision making. So the 1950s, well, it goes back even further. Ridley Stroop in the 1930s, 1935, published a seminal paper about a particular effect he had noted called cognitive dissonance. And many of us have heard that word, but don't necessarily, or that phrase, but don't necessarily know the origins. And he identified what he called the Stroop Effect, which is the dissonance that happens in your brain when what your brain is telling you consciously is somehow conflicting with what your brain is telling you subconsciously. And when that causes conflict, it creates anxiety and stress in the decision maker. And that's exactly the point of stress that we're trying to model when we use neurobiology, or when we use biometric technique, neurometric or biometric techniques to try and capture and quantify the role of emotion or non-conscious impulses in the decision-making process. So 1935, so there's a long history of doing this that we've willfully ignored as a research community. I can remember one of the very first projects I cut my teeth on was a conjoint project, and the caveats were full and perfect competition in the market, ubiquitous flow of information to consumers, and assumes that the consumer behaves rationally. So the flaw of discrete choice and choice-based conjoint methods, the flaw is inherent in the assumptions that you make to make the math work. Now, we don't want to throw out those techniques because they are very good. What we need to do is actually combine non-conscious data into those models so that we actually have a predictive model that works the way our brains work, partly rational, partly non-rational or non-conscious. So how many of you actually heard of the Stroop Effect? Of course, the sentient people have. If you haven't, there's trouble. So I'm going to show you the Stroop Effect. We're going to do this together. I don't have any things I can point to, but we're going to do this one visually and verbally. I've got two columns of words. I want you to focus on the first column only, if you can. Just look at the first column. Your task is to say the word or the color that the word is printed in. Okay, say the color the word is written in. So let's start and go down the list. I'll do it with you. So blue, brown, white, red, orange, purple, pink, green, black, gray. Very easy, very quick. Don't make any mistakes, right? Here's what happened. Here's the illustration of the Stroop Effect. Let's look at column 2. Your task is identical. Say the word, the color that the word is printed in. All right? Let's start. Brown, white, purple, blue, yellow, orange, pink, gray, brown, green. So Two things. We were much slower, and if you haven't had the practice I've had doing this, you probably made a few mistakes along the way. Those two effects combined are called the Stroop Effect. And what's happening is the word in the second column is triggering, when I read it, that's a very conscious thing. That's happening at the level of conscious. That's happening in my prefrontal cortex. That word is green. So I want to say the word green. Consciously, my brain is saying, say the word green, say the word green, because I primed you with this task originally. But then something subconsciously, or sorry, subconsciously, my brain is saying green. But consciously, I know I had this task. I was given instructions that have to override my non-conscious impulse to say green. And I have to override it and say the correct answer, which is brown. That cognitive dissonance that happens in your brain with the Stroop effect is actually the foundation of all implicit association testing research. And implicit within the world of non-conscious measurement, implicit association testing has proven to be the most scalable and effective way in a research context to actually elicit modelable data that has to do with emotion or system one processing. And so this is really the basis for everything that we do in the world of implicit association testing. Okay? So why, if this is such a great method or a great family of methods, why has it not crossed the chasm yet? If you look at the GRIT report, and it's recently been updated with the 2016 numbers, there's a slight little bit of growth. But if you look at the percent of client-side researchers using neuromarketing techniques in their research, it's climbed slowly and predictably, but it hasn't yet crossed the chasm into mainstream adoption. And so the question then becomes, why haven't these techniques crossed the chasm and become adopted by the mainstream? What I'm hoping is that the growth of mobile will accelerate the growth of non-conscious measurement techniques, since we now have a data collection vehicle that actually matches the strengths and the characteristics of a measurement technique. You've got a data collection technique and a measurement technique that actually work quite effectively together. So three keys for us as research, as the research industry, to keep in mind as we try to accelerate the growth of these techniques. The first is we have to base everything on sound science. This is a well-researched and well-published field from a neuropsychology perspective, from an academic perspective, so we have to get the science right. And unfortunately, we as researchers have allowed the emergence of a whole host of pseudoscientific measurement techniques that claim to measure implicit associations, but which actually don't. And we need to get the science right on a more consistent basis. The second thing we need to do is extend the use of these techniques beyond their current sphere of applicability, which is really around advertising testing. Lots of research data has been accumulated using galvanic skin response or fMRI or electrode caps in response to advertising. What actually happens neurologically in the brain when people are confronted with an ad? We need to expand people's awareness that these techniques are useful way beyond the field of advertising. They're actually viable in a number of different research applications, and we'll talk through some of those very quickly. We also, and probably most importantly, need to continue to be disciplined scientists in the application and further refinement of these techniques. We need to validate these techniques with real market data whenever we can, so that we can create a compelling case to the industry that these techniques are producing models that are not just statistically more elegant, but they actually are more predictive of human behavior, of consumer behavior in the marketplace. And if we can do these three things well, then I have absolute confidence in the next couple of years we will be crossing the chasm with non-conscious measurement techniques and implicit association testing specifically. So let me talk for just a couple of minutes about the science. Has everybody heard about the can't say, won't say dilemma in traditional research? So the won't say problem is that oftentimes consumers, this is in a sense called the Hawthorne effect, where people know they're being observed, and they won't give you a response, a correct response, because of the fear of social shame associated with that response. I remember doing research into television programming about 20 years ago. Nobody would admit they watched The Simpsons, but everybody watched Biography on A&E, everybody, because it was higher brow programming somehow. And so the won't say problem is quite a difficult challenge. Now, as researchers, we've developed techniques that deal with this. We've developed more projective techniques. We use derived intention rather than stated intention. So we're dealing as well as we can methodologically with the won't say technique or problem. The more pernicious problem, however, is the can't say technique. And this really has to do with the fact that a lot of these impulses are happening on a non-conscious level. And as an individual, I just don't have access to my non-conscious. I don't have conscious access to what's happening non-consciously, or it wouldn't be sub or non-conscious. And so I'm not able to tell you. This is akin to a 2-pack-a-day smoker saying, I only smoke a pack a day, either because they can't say, or they won't say that they smoke 2 packs a day, or they can't say, they just don't keep track. And so they say, I only smoke a pack a day. The problem with that is that because you're surveying them, they will feel compelled to give you a response. And that response is going to be incorrect, but you're going to be basing a lot of your insights on the verity of that response, the veracity of that response. And so that's really, dealing with those two problems is really what's behind this whole idea of implicit associations. Can I actually develop a research technique that's scalable, both online, in the mobile world, that actually gets at the consumer subconscious without the consumer having to tell me what they're thinking or how they're feeling? So one of the things that we need, I mentioned pseudoscience earlier, one of the things that we need to do and be more disciplined about is debunking the emerging myth that response latency on its own is implicit association work. It's not. True implicit techniques have to be direct, or must not be direct, they must not be deliberate, and they must not be controllable. So response latency, which is simply measuring the amount of time it takes me to sort something into one of 2 categories, is not, it's controllable in the end. I can control which way I sort. I can lie to you. And so implicit research has to get around respondents' ability to control and direct their assessments. And so, for example, if I'm looking at this little pattern, this little grid. It's the categories that I'm sorting stimuli into are like and dislike. This is a response latency technique, the always brand. If I like it, I swipe towards myself. Clash of Clans, if I don't like it, I swipe away from myself. Again, Budweiser, if I like it, I swipe towards myself. This is on a mobile device, especially where you're using approach and avoidance motivation to drive home this idea of positive, negative, approach, avoid. And that's why one of the reasons why the mobile device is such an elegant data collection platform for implicit associations. This is a response latency technique. Now let me show you what a prime technique is. Prime, I'm actually priming you with a visual prime. All right. So here the categories I'm sorting into are positive and negative. So I'm getting a gut read on whether somebody thinks an emotion that I'm going to show them is a positive or a negative. But before I show them an emotion, I'm going to show them a brand. So as before, I'm going to show them always. You see that always, that visual prime, is only up on the screen for about 500 milliseconds, about half a second. And so that visual prime is going to stimulate a non-conscious response in your brain based on how you feel about that brand. But instead of asking you to sort the brand, I'm now asking you to engage in a cognitive task, like the Stroop task did, right? So you get primed with a visual element, and then you are asked to engage in a cognitive task to sort an emoticon that's unrelated to the image, the prime that you've seen, into a positive and negative category. Now, your response latency, your ability to deal with that cognitive dissonance is very revealing. If you like Clash of Clans, you think it's positive. Your inclination after you see the visual prime, you're mentally preparing, subconsciously, to pull that towards you, to swipe that towards you. And so if you get an emoticon that's a positive, happy, you'll find it easier to sort that towards you. If you get an emoticon that's negative and you're already starting to swipe towards yourself, at least subconsciously, it'll take you measurably longer to push that icon away from you into the negative category. All right, and so after you go through repeated measures with multiple brands and different types of sorting categories, you actually get a very good sense for what someone's subconscious response to that visual stimulus is. And that's the core of implicit association testing. So applications, I want to run through this very quickly because I'm going to run out of time in about 2 minutes. I mentioned before that we do a lot of advertising testing incorporating neurometrics and biometrics, things like galvanic skin response, things like eye tracking, things like facial coding. Those are wonderfully descriptive techniques, but they're not prescriptive. They're telling you where I'm looking or telling me that I'm feeling something, but it doesn't tell you what I'm feeling. It doesn't get at the core underlying emotion from a prescriptive or predictive perspective. implicit association does that within the field of advertising testing, but also does that in a number of different research domains, from package testing, so pack size, visuals on packaging, brand research, either brand lovers or brand extension, product and concept testing, customer experience, brand tracking. There's a whole host of applications that are ideally suited for the incorporation, not the replacement of explicit measurement techniques, but the bolstering, the supplementing of implicit or of explicit research techniques. All right, I'm going to run out of time, and I've got tons of validation case studies that I'd like to talk you through. We do have a booth that's right outside here, just around from the escalator. So if you're interested at all in understanding or exploring this a little bit further and still have that question, how can this technique really get at building better predictive models, and you're curious about that, we have market validation studies in all of those domains that I talked about: advertising, pack design, new product development. Swing by our booth. I'd be happy to take you through some of these validation case studies and talk through how this might be something that is of interest for you in pursuing your research agenda.
Thank you, Joe.
Pleasure.
Go ahead and stay up here for a second. Hey, I do suggest you guys stop by the booth. I know if you guys are like me, there's a lot to digest there. But one thing, you made a comment that was around how maybe some of the technology, the platforms, the science was actually to a level that you're happy with, but the methodologies are kind of lagging behind. Mm-hmm. I assume that science, that those platforms, that technology is only continuing to grow at a faster rate than the methodology. So what do you see as the opportunity there?
Well, one of the reason that implicit association testing has really become the preferred research method for quantifying non-conscious is really because it's elegantly scalable into a general population. Anybody with an internet connection or a high-speed connection on their mobile device and a smartphone can actually take these tests, these experiments. And so it overcomes a lot of the traditional limitations of neurometrics and biometrics, which require either that the observer and the respondent be co-located, which limits your ability to sample on a representative basis, and are also extremely expensive. You need electrode caps, or you need an MRI tube. You need an infrastructure and a setup that's extremely expensive. So the next wave I see is actually starting to push some of those neurometric techniques and biometric techniques into mainstream. One of those areas is the use of virtual reality cameras. With Samsung now, you can actually buy a virtual reality glass that plugs your phone into it. And so I see those types of technology advancements where we start to get away from push stimulus and into a much richer visual environment, moving from static images to video, moving from elicitative techniques to simply observational techniques. What happens in your brain as you have these virtual reality glasses on? And so I think that's really where the science and the technology are going, and that's why mobile, again, is just such an ideally suited platform for non-conscious measurement.
That's great. All right, thanks, Joe.
Pleasure.
If you guys have any other questions, go ahead and see Sentient at their booth.